More to philanthropy than writing a check. Written and narrated by Peter J. Merrick, A.K.A. Just an old fart trying to make sense of this beautiful and mysterious thing we call life. One lesson at a time. One of the privileges of spending more than 35 years as a financial consultant is that eventually the conversations stop being about money. They become about meaning. I remember sitting across the boardroom table from a gentleman who had spent nearly 4 decades building a successful business. By every measure society uses, he had won. The business was thriving. His balance sheet was impressive. His children were grown. His grandchildren had begun arriving. He looked at me, smiled, and quietly said, "Peter, I know how to make money. What I do not know is how to make sure it becomes a blessing instead of a burden." I have never forgotten that sentence. In my experience, almost every successful person eventually arrives at that crossroads. Early in life, the questions are predictable. How do I grow my business? And how do I reduce taxes? How do I invest wisely? How do I retire comfortably? Those are important questions, but eventually another question appears. What happens after I'm gone? That is no longer a financial planning conversation. That is a legacy conversation. One of the organizations that has profoundly influenced my thinking over the years is the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners, better known as STEP. STEP is a globally respected professional organization made up of experienced trust and estate practitioners, accountants, financial advisors, fiduciaries, tax specialists, and other professionals dedicated to helping families preserve wealth, transfer it efficiently, and create meaningful legacies across generations. Every time I attend a STEP conference, I leave reminded that while tax laws evolve, human nature rarely does. Parents still worry about their children. Grandparents still hope to leave the world a little better than they found it. Successful families still wrestle with one uncomfortable question: will my wealth unite my family or divide it? That question has very little to do with money. It has everything to do with values. One discussion at a STEP conference has remained with me for years because it challenged how many people think about charitable giving. Most people believe philanthropy begins when someone writes a check. I respectfully disagree. Writing a check is often the easiest part. True philanthropy begins much earlier. It begins when someone decides what kind of impact they want their life to have long after they are no longer here. That changes everything. Throughout my career, I have met extraordinarily generous people. Some were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Others had considerably less. The interesting thing was that generosity had very little correlation with net worth. Some of the wealthiest people I met struggled to give. Some of the most generous had comparatively modest means. Generosity has never been about how much you have. It has always been about how you think. For families who wish to make charitable giving a meaningful part of their legacy, there are generally 2 primary approaches. The first is a donor advised fund. Think of it as creating your family's charitable account inside an established public foundation. You contribute assets, receive an immediate tax deduction if you qualify under applicable tax rules, and recommend charitable grants over time. The public foundation handles administration, record keeping, investment oversight, and regulatory compliance. For many families, this simplicity is exactly what they want. The second approach is establishing a private family foundation. This is a completely different level of commitment. Rather than relying on another organization to administer the charitable assets, The family creates and governs its own charitable foundation. Family members determine the mission, oversee investments, establish grant-making priorities, select charitable organizations, and shape the long-term vision of the foundation. Naturally, that greater control comes with greater responsibility. There are governance requirements, annual tax filings, accounting responsibilities, compliance obligations, investment oversight, succession planning. This is why experienced advisors become so valuable. A private family foundation is not simply another investment account. It is an institution. What fascinates me is that the greatest benefit often has nothing to do with taxes. It has everything to do with children. Imagine your children and grandchildren sitting around the same table discussing which hospital should receive funding, which scholarships should be created, which community organization is producing measurable results, which medical research deserves support. Instead of arguing over who receives the inheritance, they begin discussing how the family can improve the lives of others. That changes a family forever. Money can certainly be inherited. Character cannot. Character must be developed. Philanthropy becomes one of the classrooms where that development occurs. There are, of course, practical considerations. Some families value privacy above all else. A donor-advised fund generally offers greater confidentiality because the donor's identity often remains private. Others value control. A private family foundation allows the family to determine investment policy, charitable priorities, distribution timing, and long-term governance. Neither approach is universally better. Each involves thoughtful trade-offs. Privacy versus visibility, simplicity versus control, convenience versus responsibility. After decades in this profession, I have learned that good planning is rarely about finding the perfect answer. It is about finding the right answer for that particular family. There is another lesson I have observed repeatedly. The families who thrive over multiple generations rarely spend all of their meetings talking about money. They spend time talking about values, mission, responsibility, purpose, service. Money simply becomes the fuel. The destination is something much greater. One client said something years ago that still makes me smile. He looked at me and said, "Peter, I spent 40 years teaching my children how to make money." He paused. "I probably should have spent more time teaching them why." That may have been the most valuable financial lesson of the entire meeting. I certainly do not pretend to have all the answers to life's great mysteries. I am simply an old fart who has been fortunate enough to spend more than 3 decades listening to successful families wrestle with life's biggest questions. Their victories have taught me, their mistakes have taught me even more. One thing has become abundantly clear. Nobody has ever asked whether the casket came with extra storage space. Apparently, there is still no luggage rack on a hearse. I checked. The truth is beautifully simple. You cannot take your wealth with you, but you absolutely can decide what your wealth will do after you are gone. You can help educate a child, fund cancer research, support veterans, protect the arts, feed families, strengthen your community, or perhaps the greatest gift of all, teach future generations that wealth is not something to consume. It is something to steward. If this article has encouraged you to think differently about protecting your wealth, reducing taxes, preparing the next generation, and creating a meaningful legacy, I invite you to download our complimentary Merrick Spitters Reset Report at merrickspitters.com. The report was written for people who understand that the financial world is changing rapidly. Taxes, inflation, government debt, artificial intelligence, digital assets, longevity, and changing markets all demand a fresh perspective. More importantly, it will help you begin asking better questions, because better questions almost always lead to better financial decisions. After more than 35 years advising business owners, professionals, entrepreneurs, and multi-generational families, I have come to believe that the greatest financial return you will ever earn cannot be measured on a spreadsheet. Building wealth is an achievement. Protecting wealth is a responsibility. Passing on wisdom, that is a legacy. And true philanthropy has always been far more than writing a check. Peter J. Merrick, Trust and Estate Practitioner. Please sign up to receive newsletters at themerrickspitters.com for your complimentary copies of the Merrick Spitters Reset Report.